I think that after hearing your presentation, we can feel more confident about the ability of Chinese authorities to deal with these problems, at least in short term and in medium term. And now I open the questions for the audience. Yeah. Please. George.
I have a question to René. You spoke about the need of transparency, which I think it's a very nice thing. However, I also have the feeling that central banking is not exactly the best environment for full transparency. I would let me just give you one example. The technical specifications of Euro banknotes. You cannot publish this in the official journal of the EU. Or why do you raise, or on the contrary, you touch the interest rates or other measures of monetary policy, which can influence very strongly the capital markets and so on. So, it came to my mind one question that I have also had. For me, it was always difficult to lead with. I'm referring to the non-published legal acts of the ECB. The existence of those non-public legal acts of the ECB have as a result that nobody but the persons who work within the ECB or, well, in the committees of the Euro system, nobody really is able to write a book on the legal regime of the banking sector in EU. Nobody knows. Only knows from a few small elite of people. So I have my question is very simple. Have you certainly also you have certainly also think about this, because we shared this common experience some years ago. How do you deal with this? What would be the exact point of balance between the need for transparency and the need for secrecy? Thank you.
I know. We met there. We met there. Let me add and attribute to him a lot. Can you hear me? Attribute to him a lot of expertise that I still admire and admired when we started working together. Those of you who don't know this, in the 80s we worked at the central bank level for the second banking directive. And when there was a really tricky issue, we sometimes picked up the phone, there was no internet at that time, or otherwise communicated to make a kind of liaison, and I always was very much impressed by your interventions. So let me say that in advance. Thank you for this question. It is a killing question to say about something that it is a nice thing. I think, yes, it is a nice thing, so off the table. I fully agree with you that there are many areas in central banking, both monetary policy, banknote production, prudential supervision, that are certainly not to be subject to stringent transparency. There are obvious cases like the technical specifications. There are obvious cases like the balance sheet of a bank in trouble or the proposed supervisory measures in respect of those. It is a balancing act, a fine act, but I do think there are steps to be made, apart from the obvious economic governance issue, which you didn't touch in your question, which I think there in EMU we have a huge way to go for more transparency. In prudential supervision, I do think we have some steps to make the actual exercise thereof more transparent without going into the dangerous area. Banks' data, banks' own commercial data, are certainly an issue, and I agree with you, I would love to read the non-published decisions of the ECB. Having the floor, can I ask a question to my neighbor? Is that okay? Because I very much liked your presentation, Michael, but at some juncture you seemed like a capitalist who was endorsing a communist economic system, since you said that the state, acting on both sides of the financial sector, is a stabilizing factor. Later on in your presentation, you also said something about reform of the SEO sector. But what you said reminded me of a booklet that I edited a couple of years ago about Islamic finance, in which one of the authors of a chapter said, well, if we had had more Islamic finance, we might have had a less severe economic downturn because of the financial character of those kind of finances, you know, longer term, different role of the economic actors. My question to you is the fact that we have this state-controlled system one of the reasons why we have to fear less for a crisis from China, and if not, how should this reform be affected without making China crisis prone?
Thank you, Remy. It's an interesting question. I think to answer it fully would require quite a long response. But certainly, from the point of view of the systemic problem that I was identifying, then a mitigating factor is the role of the state on both sides of the balance sheet. However, I think we have to bear in mind that having the state on both sides of the balance sheet is also a very important source of moral hazard, that it distorts lending decisions quite substantially, and that one of the consequences of that has been that the formal banking system, the large state-owned banks, have been very reluctant to provide credit to the private sector and to SMEs, and they have, by necessity, needed to go to the shadow banking system for finance. So in looking at it purely in terms of whether it reduces systemic risk at the current conjuncture, it does, but it's also true that if you look at this in a broader context, the state's involvement on both sides of the balance sheet has actually led to major distortions in terms of credit supply and credit allocation. One of the reasons why the state-owned enterprises have been able to leverage up as much as they have is because they've enjoyed this implicit guarantee from the government. In a market-based system, the financial system would have stopped supplying them with credit some time ago because the risks would have been perceived as being too high.
Thank you. There will be credit grants. To René or to Michael?
Something to Michael about the evolution of Chinese reserves. I think in your graphs, I don't know if the data you're using are updated to March or, I don't know, the spring of this year, because we have seen a huge outflow at the beginning of the year. I don't know if it's still ongoing, about 100 billion a month, actually, dollars. How do you explain that? And do you think that actually a little bit of capital outflow from China could be, in the end, beneficial because of what we're seeing in the country, or overeating sector, because of too much of credit going this sector?
Well, again, a very interesting question. What we've seen in the last couple of months is that the very substantial outflows that we were seeing at the end of last year have now more or less stopped. By the end of last year, we had seen over a 12 or 14 month period around 800 billion US dollars of official reserves leave the country. So for a country with capital controls, that's a very substantial outflow. Now, there are various explanations as to what those outflows related to. Some of it, and this is the official explanation, is that some of it was due to Chinese companies repaying their foreign debt because they were able to refinance domestically, and it became cheaper to refinance domestically, and also expectations about a steady appreciation of the renminbi had changed. And that was certainly a factor, but it only accounts for around 30% of that outflow. So the rest of it was certainly some form of capital flight from China, which accelerated after August the 11th last year, which was when the People's Bank of China made a change to the way that the renminbi's daily fixing operates. And because that was not well communicated, what their intention was, that was what triggered the market volatility in the late August of last year. And with that, we also saw these very substantial outflows. Now, they have stopped, and there are various explanations of why they've stopped. One of them is certainly, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the authorities have been applying the capital controls much more rigorously than they did in the past, or certainly in recent years. It's now quite difficult to move money out of the country. And they're trying to make it more, they're trying to ensure that it's difficult to move money out of the country. That stopped the decline of reserves in the short term. The other factor that's helped them has been relative dollar softness, because the outflows were quite strongly correlated with dollar strength. So as the dollar expectations of rises in dollar interest rates have declined, the pressure on the renminbi has also declined, and so outflows have tended to slow down. But it still is a concern that for a country with capital controls to see $800 billion in reserves declining over just over a year is a very big decline. And certainly if that was to begin again, then the reserves adequacy numbers that I put up, you would soon get into the sort of territory where you would say, well, maybe official reserves are no longer adequate.
And put the question to you still. Do you think that the consumption rate of the Chinese is increasing and the rate of investment, of course, is decreasing? Or the trend is still in the sense of a very, very high rate of investment in China?
Well, again, a very interesting question. Investment in China has risen to levels which are exceptional, even compared to the Asian tiger economies during their growth spurt. So if you look at countries like Korea or Japan or Taiwan, during the periods when they grew very rapidly, investment as a percentage of GDP was around 35% at its peak, sometimes towards about 40%, but certainly below 40%. In China, until a couple of years ago, investment had risen to around 50% of GDP. So investment was a very big driver of the economy. One of the objectives of the Chinese authorities is to rebalance the economy more towards consumption. We are starting to see that. There is evidence that this is happening, that domestic consumption is now starting to play a larger role, that investment is declining as a share of GDP, although, as I indicated in the presentation, what's happened this year, basically to ensure that growth doesn't slow down below the 6.5% boundary that the authorities have set for themselves, we've seen investment ramping up again. And I think the other question, where at the moment we don't have an answer, is will consumption hold up if reform of the state-owned enterprise sector and restructuring of the state-owned enterprise sector really takes off seriously? Because if you start to see unemployment, if people start losing their jobs as a result of that, it's very hard to imagine that consumption will also not be affected.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to read the closing address of Mr. Luís Máximo dos Santos, a member of the board of Bank of Portugal. Unfortunately, he had he is in Bank of Portugal, he couldn't attend the closing session. So I'm going to read his address in Portuguese, because if you don't mind. So, muito boa tarde a todos. Gostaria de começar por cumprimentar os oradores e os participantes na conferência. É uma honra poder proferir algumas palavras no contexto do encerramento de uma conferência com oradores de tão excepcional qualidade, cujas notáveis intervenções nos deliciaram o espírito pela sua profundidade, clareza, sentido crítico e, por vezes, subtil ironia, que igualmente soube muito bem ouvir. Os temas da resolução bancária, por exemplo, por vezes áridos e pesados, através de intervenções dos professores Charles Goodhart e Marco Lamandini, surgiram-nos claros na sua complexidade e atrativos como as melhores áreas de ópera. Esta é a quinta edição de uma conferência que todos os anos nos vem enriquecendo. Pela minha parte, confesso que sou participante desde a primeira, que julgo que foi em 2011, e foi realmente, e sempre com enorme proveito. É assim da mais elementar justiça dar os parabéns ao Centro de Investigação, Regulação e Supervisão Financeira, na pessoa do seu coordenador, professor Luís Moraes. Certamente todos me acompanharão nesta expressão de reconhecimento ao professor Luís Moraes pela concepção e organização destas sucessivas conferências anuais que tão úteis têm sido para todos os que, no plano académico ou profissional, ou em ambos, têm que lidar com os problemas da regulação e supervisão financeira. Por tudo isto, o Banco de Portugal tem apoiado a realização desta conferência, sendo também motivo de satisfação partilhar esse apoio com a Autoridade de Seguros e Fundos de Pensões, a quem saúdo na pessoa do seu presidente, professor José Almassa, que na sua intervenção lembrou, e muito bem, a importância dos temas do setor segurador fazerem parte dos trabalhos da conferência. Desde o início da crise financeira global, que os problemas do setor financeiro e o modo de os resolver se tornaram, um pouco por todo o lado, um tema dominante nas agendas políticas nacionais das principais organizações económicas internacionais. E, claro, a preocupação primeira dos reguladores e supervisores financeiros. Não nos podemos espantar que assim seja. A gigantesca dimensão das perdas que a crise gerou, com a consequente instabilidade económica, social e política, levanta interrogações múltiplas e profundas, sendo generalizado o reconhecimento de que existe a necessidade de uma alteração no paradigma da gestão bancária que faça emergir uma nova cultura na abordagem da atividade financeira. Esse caminho tem estado a ser percorrido, talvez com lentidão. É imperioso que continue a sê-lo, pois só com essa evolução os sistemas financeiros cumprirão o seu papel insubstituível na promoção do desenvolvimento económico, objetivo a que não podemos renunciar, mesmo quando alguns veem surgir no horizonte dos países mais desenvolvidos o que designam por uma época de estagnação secular. É indispensável não ter medo de discutir seriamente e com sentido de responsabilidade os problemas do sistema financeiro. Em Portugal, por exemplo, o tema da União Bancária não teve, na minha opinião, o debate que a sua importância requeria. Nas instituições europeias, nos reguladores e supervisores nacionais, no plano do poder político, temos de trabalhar construtivamente e articuladamente para ultrapassar as dificuldades, no respeito das respectivas competências e salvaguardando a independência das instituições que beneficiam desse estatuto. São precisas formas de esclarecimento e regras de accountability eficazes, pois só assim se legitimará perante a comunidade a centralidade que o sistema financeiro ganhou nas sociedades contemporâneas. Só desse modo os cidadãos não sentirão que decisões fundamentais para as suas vidas lhes passam completamente à margem. Tanto ao nível da União Europeia e das suas diversas instituições, como no plano dos diferentes Estados-membros, não nos podemos barricar em trincheiras, talvez cómodas, mas seguramente ineficazes. Tem de haver espírito aberto e flexibilidade, sobretudo porque muito do que estamos a fazer em conjunto na União Europeia é profundamente inovador e, por isso, é mais incerto e arriscado. Não podemos cair no vício da autossuficiência ou do autocontentamento, que nos falou John Kenneth Galbraith, num contexto, aliás, bem mais auspicioso do que o presente. Pois, nesse caso, será muito difícil encontrar os melhores caminhos no plano europeu e no plano nacional. Também por isso, esta conferência foi tão importante. E esta, enfim, é a mensagem que o Dr. Luís Máximo dos Santos teria querido dirigir a esta conferência para a sessão, na sessão final e de fecho da conferência. Professor Luís Moraes, não sei qual agora o que está previsto, encerramento da conferência. Bom, então, em nome, enfim, da presidência da conferência, em nome do Sr. Presidente da Autoridade dos Seguros, eu declaro encerrada a conferência, dou os parabéns a todos os participantes, agradeço às muitas pessoas que aqui estiveram e desejo que no futuro estas conferências continuem a ter a qualidade, a inovação e o interesse que tiveram as primeiras edições e que seguramente continuarão a ter no futuro estas conferências, que se devem exclusivamente à qualidade dos nossos speakers, dos nossos oradores. Muito obrigado. Considero finalizada esta sessão.